Okay, we'll make a start. Um, Thank you for joining. My name is Jamal Gordon. I'm a security, compliance, and identity architect here at CPS. And today we're going to be talking about AI data risks for Microsoft Copilot, but specifically a slightly different question, which is around device security. So are your devices actually secure? Um, a lot of organizations focus heavily on data governance when they start their journey with AI and their journey with Copilot, which is absolutely the right thing to do. But this is a bit of a hidden risk that doesn't get spoken about quite so much. And what we're going to do is explore that today, which is the other side of the equation. Because if your data is secure and the device that you're using to access it isn't, the risk still exists. Okay. So let me quickly walk you through what we're going to cover today so you know what to expect. We'll start with the business impact of AI, so why organizations are investing in tools like Copilot and what is the real value that they're seeing. Then we'll look at Copilot and how it actually interacts with your data. So this is around how do we know what Copilot can access from a user's perspective. And that is critical for understanding the risk that I'm going to continue talking about around endpoints. So from there, we'll move into device security and why that matters, including some real world scenarios like lost devices, vulnerable endpoints, and people accessing corporate data from personal devices. And we'll then explore how organizations can reduce that risk using Microsoft Intune and conditional access before we finish with what does good look like. We do have time for a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, my colleague Stella will be keeping an eye on the chat. We also do have a Q&A section in the Teams webinar, so please do drop any questions there and we'll address those when we get to the end of the presentation. So let's start with the business impact of AI. Before we dive into risk, governance, or control, it's important to understand why organizations are so interested in this technology in the first place, because the benefits are very real and they're driving rapid adoption, and we're seeing it firsthand here at CPS as well. So AI, and particularly tools like Microsoft Copilot, are being adopted because they fundamentally change how people work day to day, not by necessarily replacing them, but by augmenting their existing roles. So the first area we see massive impact is in enhanced team efficiency. So AI helps teams collaborate more effectively by pulling together information that's already spread across your emails, your documents, Teams chats, and meetings, right? So instead of searching, reworking, or duplicating effort, teams can focus on moving work forward together using Copilot as a driver. Importantly, Copilot doesn't create new data. It works with what already exists within Microsoft 365. Closely related to that is task assistance. So AI reduces cognitive load on employees by helping with everyday activities. So things like drafting content, summarizing long email threads, preparing for meetings, or answering questions, right? And this frees up people to spend more time on what we'd consider to be higher value and more meaningful work rather than, the low-hanging fruit or the administrative tasks. We also see faster time to value. So AI shortens the gap between insight and action, whether that's analyzing information, extracting key points, or helping someone to take that next step. So Copilot accelerates how quickly your initial ideas can turn into outcomes. Organizations that use AI well don't just work harder, they move faster, right? Another major benefit is workflow automation. So especially when we're talking about agents, AI can assist in automating repetitive or very manual tasks that previously slowed people down. So by streamlining those tasks and those workflows, we can reduce friction in business processes and improve consistency across departments. And finally, there's improved decision making. So AI supports better decisions by surfacing relevant insights from large volumes of information. Often this is happening in real time, right? So leaders and teams can make more informed choices without needing to manually analyze data themselves. And all of these benefits on the screen are very real. It's why Copilot is currently generating so much interest. But the important thing to keep in mind as we move through the session is that AI amplifies what's already there. And what that means is the good and the risky, right? If information is well protected, Copilot becomes a powerful accelerator for all of the things that I just mentioned on screen. If access or data or your devices is poorly controlled, governed, and secured, AI can make those issues far more visible very quickly. That's what today's session is really about, right? So this is one of the most important slides of the session, something that's fundamental to understand when we talk about security and Copilot. So Copilot respects existing permissions, okay? It only works within the same Microsoft 365 permissions that the user already has today. And this is the user that is driving Copilot and asking questions and using prompts, right? If a user can't see it normally, then Copilot can't see it either. It doesn't go around your security controls. It won't elevate somebody's access. It doesn't magically do anything that the user wouldn't be able to do themselves. So we can break that down, right? Starting with Outlook, Copilot can only access things like the emails the user already has permission to read, calendar entries, and meetings that they were invited to. Also attachments that they can already own. So if a user can't open an email or an attachment themselves, then Copilot can't do that either. The same principle applies to Microsoft Teams. So Copilot can work with chats and channels where the user is already a member. Any of the files stored in those teams or channels, and conversations and content from meetings that they've actually attended. So it doesn't gain visibility into things like private teams, private chats, or any sort of meeting that the user was not already part of. Moving on to SharePoint. So this is where things get a bit more interesting from a risk perspective, because Copilot can access all sites and document libraries that the user already has access to, right? Any files and folders that have been shared with them, and it all uses the same permission inheritance that already exists in your SharePoint Online tenant. So Copilot doesn't change that access, it just reflects it. With OneDrive, the scope's a lot more simple. It's the user's own files and any files that have been explicitly shared with them. And finally, within your Microsoft 365 apps like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, Copilot can work with the documents that you already have open. It can only see the data in those documents that the permissions allow, and it respects the same view and edit rights that apply to the user. So if you've opened a document and you only have read-only access to that document, Copilot can't then go through and make edits. It respects what you have. So Copilot cannot access the data that you don't already have permission to see. It can't bypass SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive security, and it can't ignore things like sensitivity labels, encryption, or any other existing control you have in place. So it's very obedient from a security standpoint. From a technical perspective, it behaves exactly like a user. So what determines how Copilot identifies you as a user? It's a mixture between the identity and the device that you use to access it. So that's why we're discussing device security today in this session. Okay. So now we've got an idea as to how Copilot and the permissions work. Let's move into why device security matters. This is often the missing piece in AI conversations, right? So everything we've spoken about ultimately comes down to one thing: the devices that people are using. So across many organizations today, you'll typically see a mixture of either corporate-owned devices and personal devices. So on the left-hand side, we have corporate-owned devices. These are company-issued laptops, desktops, tablets, smartphones, and they're all fully managed and controlled by IT, right? They're typically enrolled into a platform like Microsoft Intune, so a modern device management platform. And that's where you go to enroll your policy, enforce your policies, apply things like security baselines, and continuously check that these devices meet your internal standards. From a risk perspective, if these are managed well, these are generally considered your most controlled and trusted devices, right? This brings us to the right-hand side where we've got the personal devices, or bring your own device, or BYOD. I might refer to it as BYOD throughout this presentation, by the way. But when I say that, we're talking about personal devices. So a personal laptop, a personal phone, a personal tablet. These are devices that the organization don't fully own or manage, right? These devices might still access corporate data. So you might still be able to access your email, documents, Microsoft Teams, or SharePoint, but the level of control that you have as an organization is significantly different. So in many cases, security here relies on a combination of what we're expecting users to do, so that user behavior, what application level controls, and what policies we can put in place from an organizational perspective to deploy some sort of safety net on those devices, right? Access to corporate data also happens in a lot more ways nowadays. So it no longer happens in one single controlled way. People are accessing data from cloud applications, email and attachments, web browsers, potentially file shares and collaboration platforms. We've got mobile apps and even removable media on home networks, right? So when we ask the question, how secure are your devices? What I'm really asking is, how confident are we that in every single way that data can be accessed securely across the organization? Because your data might be well protected in Microsoft 365, but the experience of accessing it happens across a very diverse and sometimes uncontrolled device landscape. That's where the risk starts to creep in. So now let's connect that device picture directly to Copilot, because this is where things become much more significant. So generative AI, like Copilot, acts as a multiplier, not just for productivity, but also for risk. So traditionally, if someone gained access to a device, they would still need to know where to look. They might have to search through your file shares, browse your emails, or try to understand how your specific organization stores their data, right? And that's given, in some cases, right, security teams a bit more time to identify a potential breach, put some policies in place, lock it down. With Copilot, that barrier's removed, right? We can simply ask a question and Copilot will bring back the answer. And that's why our device security is very important. Because devices are where our identity is validated, our sessions are trusted, and data is actually accessed and often cached locally on that device. But at the same time, these devices, they enable things like mobility, productivity, and flexible working, right? These are all good things that they support. So there is a balance. It's absolutely essential to support this because it's how modern organizations operate. But this is where the risk comes in, because Copilot, as I said, it can instantly summarize sensitive content. So Copilot corporate data is often stored locally or even temporarily. And crucially, there's no need to search the old-fashioned way. You just ask the question, information is returned. So just as an example, if a attacker compromises a device and they use Copilot to say, hi, Copilot, can you provide me this HR information, and the user has access to that folder, or this information about sales or potentially corporate secrets, Copilot can surface that very quickly. So this is really what I want everyone to understand. Before AI, risk was limited by effort and knowledge. With AI, that barrier is dramatically lowered. So if we have an impact of a compromised device, it becomes much of a greater risk much faster. So let's now make this a bit more concrete by looking at the main types of endpoint risks we see in organizations. And the first one is probably the most intuitive. It's where we've got a lost or a stolen device. So if a device is lost and it has maybe active sessions or cached credentials on it, there's a real risk of unauthorized access. Now, before Copilot, that might still require someone to manually go in and explore your systems and try to find something useful. But with Copilot, that story changes, right? An attacker could simply just ask, show me a financial report, summarize the HR documents, and get that access very rapidly. The second risk is unpatched or vulnerable devices. So if a device isn't regularly updated, it becomes vulnerable to things like known exploits, malware, remote code execution attacks. We see every single day there's a new report on a new exploit or something that can be taken advantage of on a device. So it is very important to make sure that you're keeping these things up to date. They can lead to things like credential theft, session hijacking, or persistent access to your entire corporate systems at a worst case, right? As I mentioned before, once an attacker has that foothold, Copilot can amplify what they can do with it. The third area are non-compliant devices. So these are devices that don't meet your defined security standards. So for example, a device might be lacking encryption. It might not have the proper protections or policies in place. So this introduces risks around policy violations, data exposure, and a bit of a different one, but even when it comes to auditing or legal concerns, it's very important to ensure that our devices are compliant. And finally, shared devices. So this introduces a very different challenge around accountability and control. So you might not have a clear audit trail if something happens. And there's a risk of data cross-contamination between users as well. So especially if we're talking about Copilot and we've got users using shared identity, that shared identity is where all of the Copilot permissions are inherited to. Okay? When you take all of these together, the key message is just, devices are not just an access point, they're potential application point for risk. When you layer AI on top of that, the speed and impact of the risk increases significantly. Now let's focus specifically on BYOD, or bring your own device. So these are personal devices. And this is important because it's where a lot of organizations feel there's tension between flexibility and security, right? So on the left side of the image, we have what we would call trusted access, and these are our managed corporate-owned devices, laptops or phones, and they're owned by the organization, configured by IT, and continuously monitored if it's been configured correctly. On these devices, you'll have your compliance policies in place, encryption enabled, endpoint protection running, and the ability to remotely wipe or lock the device if you need to. So let's say it's lost, we can do that remotely and clear the entire device. So if you have these in place from a security perspective, you may have a high level of confidence here. Now let's contrast that with bring your own device. So where we've got personal devices, this is where we could potentially see higher risk, right? People are still accessing corporate data from them, emails, teams, and documents, but you may not have the same level of control at the moment. So you don't necessarily need to know if a device is patched or if it's encrypted, or well, you don't necessarily know if a device is patched or encrypted, or who else could be using it. Okay, someone might give their iPad to their kid when they finish work to use it then. So this introduces risks like data leakage into personal apps. An example of that is like copy and pasting work notes out of OneNote or something within your Microsoft 365 tenant, and maybe pasting that into the native device notes app, right? Credential theft is another risk here, and just the lack of visibility or control as to what is happening with your data on these devices once they have left your secure environment. Now, in the center of the slide, we've got a security enforcement layer, right? And this is where our modern controls come into play. So things like Identity controls, how do we manage that identity? Device checks and mobile application management policies. These are things that I'll go into more detail in the session if these aren't familiar to you, but this is how we essentially underpin our device security and governance, right? It's quite important because what we need to think about is instead of trying to control every device completely, our new goal becomes how do we apply the right level of control at the point of access? So whether someone's on a corporate device or a personal device, we can still look at how we enforce how our data is accessed, what can be done with it, and what level of risk is acceptable. Okay. So how do we reduce these risks? The core principle is we don't look to secure Copilot directly. We're securing the conditions under which it runs. That means we're looking at ensuring that devices are trusted, access is controlled, data is protected on our devices, and we have the ability to respond quickly if something does go wrong. With all of these layers, when they work together, you drastically reduce the risk that is posed from an endpoint perspective when we're talking about AI and Copilot. And this is where Microsoft Intune plays a key role. So I'm going to walk through 4 core capabilities that are particularly important in the context of Copilot. These aren't all of the capabilities of Copilot, Intune. But these are things that I feel are quite important to make sure that we discuss, right? So the first is endpoint security baselines. So this is how we remove guesswork from security. Instead of manually deciding how every device should be configured, Intune does provide sort of Microsoft recommended baselines that you can apply at scale. And these do things like enable device encryption, enforcing firewall policies, or disabling legacy or insecure protocols that could lead to a breach in the future. Your baselines might vary depending on what industry regulations you need to comply with, right? So we don't have to use the built-in Microsoft baselines. We can tailor them specifically to our organizational requirements. And this is so that you're starting from a strong, consistent security foundation. Okay. The second is when we're talking about compliance policies. So compliance policies, they act as our gatekeeper. Intune will continuously check whether a device meets your defined standards. So it will check, is a device patched? Is it encrypted? Is it protected against malware? And if a device falls behind that standard, you can then take action to immediately block it from accessing corporate data. By default, that then blocks Copilot on that device from accessing that data. The third capability here is mobile application management, so MAM, which is very critical for bring your own device or personal device scenarios. So this allows you to protect corporate data within the app itself without needing to manage the entire device. So we can do things like prevent copying and pasting into personal apps, restricting what users can download from your Microsoft 365 tenant, and controlling where that data is stored. So do we want to allow users to store our corporate documents directly on their device, or do we want to make sure that they are using OneDrive and they are using SharePoint Online when they're working with, company data? Importantly, this is done without touching or monitoring the personal content on that device. So we're honing in directly on our corporate data that exists on those devices. And the final capability on here to cover is remote wipe and data protection. So I alluded to this before when I was talking about corporate devices. If a device is lost or it's no longer trusted, you can respond immediately by wiping the device, right? If it's a corporate device, you can wipe it entirely. If it is a personal device or a BYOD device, we can perform a selective wipe on that device, which only removes the corporate data. So we're not impacting the user's personal data on that device. We're just wiping our corporate data. And that's really useful, actually, just in general, where we have users let's say we do allow bring your own device and we have people leaving the organization, right? And that headcount's changing. We might want to go through and just make sure that we're wiping any corporate data that they might be taking on with them. When you bring all four of these things together, Intune gives you preventative controls and response capabilities, and that's exactly what you need in a world where devices are a key part of your risk posture. Building on top of that, we have conditional access, which is really the engine that ties all of this together. So a simple way to think about conditional access is that it evaluates signals, it makes a decision, and then it enforces that in real time. So I'll break that down in simpler terms. On the left side here, we've got signals. So when someone's trying to access any resource from Microsoft 365, it can look at who the user is, what device they're using, what application they're accessing it from, and where physically they're accessing that from. So this isn't all in isolation. The signals can be a combination of these things. So we might look at, is the user high risk? And is the device they're using trusted? And are they working from an expected location, right, or country? And this information is evaluated every time someone tries to access your environment. Then we have the decision. So based on those signals, we can go and define rules such as, well, is it okay? Do we want to grant them full access, or do we want to limit that access? Or do we want to block access entirely, right? If the user's using a device that's fallen out of compliance, right? Then we have enforcement. So the decision is applied immediately in real time every time access is attempted. And that's where the real power comes in, because rather than trusting access by default, we're continuously evaluating the risk. For example, a user on a secure corporate device might get full access. The same user on a personal device might get restricted access, and a risky or unknown device might just be blocked entirely. And that aligns very closely with zero trust principles, where nothing is implicitly trusted and everything is verified. The key takeaway is this: Copilot conditional access gives you the ability to control access dynamically based on the risk, which is essential when Copilot's involved, because you're not just controlling access to systems, you're controlling access to the data that they can access, and that can be surfaced through AI. So at this stage, a very common question we get is, this all makes sense, but what should we really be reviewing or focusing on, right? And now I want to be clear, you don't need to become an expert in all of these areas. This is fairly high level. This slide represents sort of key building blocks of a secure device posture. So in simple terms, these are the controls that determine whether a device is safe to access your data and therefore safe to use Copilot. So I'll walk through them at a very high level. Firstly, we have administrative templates or security baselines, and these are all about making sure your devices are configured consistently across the organization. So things like security settings, system behaviors, and your minimum standards. So instead of every device being slightly different, you have a known secure starting point, so your baseline. Next, we have device restrictions. So this is simply about controlling what users can and can't do on a device. For example, can they install applications freely? Can data be shared externally? Or can they change, key operating system settings that you might want to protect? So these controls reduce the risk of accidental or unauthorized data exposure. Then looking at endpoint protection, so this is your core defense layer. So things like your antivirus, your threat detection, and encryption. So this is what protects devices from malware, phishing attacks, and other common threats. And then we have identity protection, which ensures that only trusted users can sign in. So when we talk about identity protection, we're mostly talking about Windows Hello for Business, which allows you to use biometrics, Face ID, or a PIN when you're logging into a device. So just because a device is secure, right, there's a risk if the wrong person is sitting behind that device, right? So that's what identity protection is all about. Then we have VPN configuration. So that's to ensure that users are accessing your corporate data if they're outside of the office, for example, they're working from home or a public network or in a cafe, that their connection is secure. Okay. And then finally, BIOS configuration, which is a lot more foundational, to be honest. It's so this is looking at protecting the device at a very low level before the operating system starts. So we're helping to prevent tampering or unauthorized changes. Okay. Now, I appreciate that's a lot. I'll summarize it in a much simpler way. All of these controls come together to help us understand if a device is safe enough to access our data. If the answer is yes, we can allow access. And if the answer is no, we can look at restricting or blocking that. So we go from trusting devices by default to verifying that they're actually secure before we allow access. So now let's talk about mobile application management, or MAM. I might refer to it as MAM. So that's why I've put it in brackets on the slide. I just want to be really clear about where this sits. Okay, so this capability is specifically designed for personal devices or those bring your own device scenarios. Okay, so currently we only have the capability to use MAM across phones. So this can be Android or iOS or iPadOS, tablets, and Windows devices. So Mac OS and Chromebooks are not yet supported in this area, but we hope to see something soon from Microsoft, fingers crossed. So when employees use their own phones, tablets, or laptops to access corporate data, this is how you secure that access without taking over control of their entire device. And that's a really important distinction because in most organizations, you don't want to fully manage someone's personal device, right? That raises privacy concerns, and understandably so. People won't be very happy with that. So instead, this approach shifts to something a bit more targeted. We're looking at protecting the corporate data on that device, not the entire personal device. So the core component of mobile application management is when we're looking at application protection policies or app protection policies. So these are policies that apply directly to the applications that people are using. So things like Outlook, Microsoft Teams, Word, or Excel, we're targeting the apps on their personal devices. And this lets us control things like, can corporate data be copied in and out of these personal apps? Can corporate documents be saved on the device? Or do we need to enforce that if you're saving a corporate document, it has to go in OneDrive or SharePoint? And what else can we do with that document, right? Do we want to allow users to print or export that document? So we can control that at an app level without controlling the full device. The second thing that's important, quite important here, is company portal, and this is where we're creating something quite practical for users. So the easiest way to think of company portal is it's the front door for users to access corporate apps and data on a personal device. We also see company portal on our corporate devices as well, but the use cases are slightly different. It depends on why you're deploying it. So for mobile application management, it's essentially the application that ties the device to the user and checks they are who they say they are and verifies their credentials. It then allows them to have that access, right? So instead of users just signing into your corporate systems in an unmanaged way, Company Portal provides a very simple, guided way for them to access what they need, and it's secure. From a user's perspective, the process is quite straightforward. They sign into Company Portal. They may see approved apps like Outlook or Teams to install in a secure way. But once they've authenticated with Company Portal, the policies are on their applications. So once they are using those applications, they are secure how we have configured it. We also have work profiles for Android. Now, this is specifically for Android, but the best way or the easiest way to think about work profile is it creates a separate work and personal, it creates a separation between work and personal data on the same device. So if someone is using their own phone, instead of mixing everything together, the device is effectively split into two containers or buckets, right? So we've got one for their personal apps and their personal data. If a user already had the device before, they don't have to do anything specific to access that. From their perspective, the device is exactly the same as it's always been. And then we have a separate container for our corporate apps and corporate data, which is managed directly through company portal. From the user's perspective, it's fairly, it looks very simple and clean, right? They'll have their personal apps as normal, things like social media, personal emails and photos, which goes completely untouched, and then a separate set of work apps and other corporate tools that sit inside a secure and managed place. The important thing is what happens behind the scenes. So everything in that work profile is protected by your organization's policies. So the app protection policies that we were referring to, and they can be controlled in terms of how data is used. We can remove it if needed. So we can do a remote wipe on that corporate data profile, essentially. And everything outside of that, the personal side, it stays completely private to the user. So we can't see their personal photos, we can't access their messages, and we don't manage their whole device. So just to summarize this in a simple way, if corporate devices are about full control, then mobile application management is about targeted control. It allows you to confidently say, yes, you can use your personal device, and yes, you can access this corporate data, but it's done in a way that is secure, controlled, and respects user privacy. When we bring this back to Copilot, it's pretty important, right? Because it ensures that even if sensitive data is surfaced through AI, it stays within a protected environment, even if it's on a personal device. So at this point, we've spoken about devices, we've talked about the risks, and we've talked about the controls. So this is just to bring them all together, because device compliance is what connects everything, basically. At its core, device compliance is about ensuring that only devices that meet your security standards are allowed to access corporate data. So it asks the device questions like, are you patched? Are you encrypted? And do you have endpoint protection running at the highest level, right? If a device meets those conditions, it's considered compliant. And if it doesn't, it could be considered non-compliant. That's when we can take action. It's incredibly powerful. It means you're no longer relying on assumptions. So I've deployed a policy that, enables antivirus on all devices. Instead of assuming that it's just working, we can make sure that that is checked on a continual basis, and we're making sure that it is enforced. The 4 key outcomes I want to highlight here. The first is preventing access from risky devices. So if a device is out of date, unprotected, or unknown, it simply doesn't get full access to your environment. The second is reducing the impact of a lost or stolen device. So even if a device is compromised, the moment it becomes non-compliant, we can cut off access very quickly. The third is protecting data on personal devices, and that's really important. We can allow access from personal devices, but still ensure that corporate data is handled securely without needing to monitor personal content. And finally, it strengthens Copilot security itself, because Copilot ensures that Copilot is only operating on a trusted device, right? A trusted and secure device. So instead of asking, can users access this data? Now we're asking, can the device safely access this data? Before we wrap up, I want to take a minute to talk about Windows Autopilot as well. So I don't see this spoken about enough when it comes to this. In enterprise scenarios, nearly 80 to 85% of organizations use Windows devices as their main daily driver. And because one of the biggest challenges most organizations face is not necessarily around securing the devices, but it's making sure that every device is set up securely in the first place. Traditionally, that's a manual process. It's a bit of a mess, right? IT teams, and we've all seen it, they'll sit there, they'll build devices, they'll configure the settings, install the applications. But that introduces two problems, right? The first one is it takes time. We're using IT resource to do that, a very manual task on every device that they need to deploy or give to a user. And number two, it creates inconsistency because every once in a while there's going to be a mistake. A policy will forget to get set, an app will forget to be installed, right? And this is where Windows Autopilot comes in. So Autopilot is what ensures that every device starts its life already secure and compliant. Imagine a brand new laptop. Instead of being configured by IT, the user simply turns it on and connects to the internet. And from that point, everything's automatic. The device recognizes it belongs to your organization. It will apply all of your security settings, install any required applications, and enforce your compliance policies, all in the background, right? A few key benefits to this. The first, it's secure from first use. So security isn't something that we're adding in later. It's on the device from the start. The second is that consistency. And the third is that there's no manual setup. So no human error, ensuring that nothing's missed. Finally, it supports modern working. So devices can be deployed from anywhere, whether someone is physically in the office or they're working remotely from home. IT don't need to ever touch that device. So to wrap up, this brings us to our key question: what does good actually look like? Because most organizations already have some controls in place. The challenge is, understanding whether they are strong enough for something like Copilot. And the simplest way to think about this is your AI tools are only as secure as the device accessing them. So rather than trusting devices by default, we need to move towards continuous validation, checking that devices are secure every time they access data, which can sound like a headache, but it's very simple and automated once it's done right. There are a few common device security failures that we come across. So these are things like unpatched operating systems or vulnerable browsers, no clear separation between personal and corporate data, missing encryption, shared or unmonitored devices, and often a lack of visibility into the health of those devices as well. These issues have always existed, right? They've just accelerated with the introduction of AI, and they're a lot more visible and impactful. So what does good device security look like? So this isn't about perfection, it's about consistency and control. It includes things like well-designed conditional access policies, strong use of mobile application management, automated patching, real-time visibility into device health, and proactive endpoint protection. So we're shifting from we think our devices are secure to we can prove our devices are secure continuously. And that's what gives us confidence to move forward with Copilot, because at that point, you're not just enabling AI, you're enabling it in a controlled and trusted environment. Okay, got about 15 minutes left. I'm just going to ask my colleague Stella if there are any questions in the chat and if she's able to, or in the Q&A section, and if you're able to read them out to me, that would be okay.
Absolutely. So the first question we have is, are we increasing our risk by turning Copilot on?
Okay, that's a good question, and the short answer is no. You're not increasing your risk by turning Copilot on. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Copilot's quite well behaved from a security perspective because it only works with the data that the user already has access to. It's not creating anything new. What it does do, however, is it makes your existing issues more visible, right? So you're not increasing the risk, but you're able to see the risk more clearly. And that's why it's important to get ahead of this when it comes to devices and when we're looking at how we protect our data directly. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
The second question was, do we need to block personal devices completely?
So no, you don't need to. In most cases, you don't really want to, right? From experience, blocking personal devices entirely can create friction from users, and it can actually limit flexibility. So especially in our, modern work environments that we've got now, I think the better approach is to focus on what we discussed today in terms of mobile application management and how we protect the data, rather than how we control an entire device or how we stop people from using a specific type of device, right? And I think that's quite important to understand that distinction, especially if we're coming from, a world where people could access corporate data freely, and we're making that change. We can do that in a more accepted way that is still very secure when it comes to your corporate data. Okay. Stella, any others?
Yes, we have two more in the chat. So, what's the balance between security and flexibility?
So modern security is all about balance. Instead of locking everything down, the approach we recommend is to apply controls based on risk and context. So I think that's where we're looking at that sort of balance. The best example of that is where we're talking about our BYOD devices, right? Microsoft have taken a shift more towards flexibility, especially since we were all locked down 5 years ago, right? And everybody started taking their devices home to work. We've seen an increase in what we can do to protect our data when we are working from home. So I would say there is a balance between security and flexibility, but you don't have to choose, right? You can have both.
Perfect. And then the last question was, how much of this is already included in an E3 license?
So in many cases, a lot of the capabilities I spoke about today, they're already in an E3 license. And what we see is a lot of organizations are paying for stuff and they don't necessarily utilize everything. So you already have access to Intune for the device management aspect, conditional access, mobile application management, and a lot of the core security features. What we typically see, the gap isn't the technology, it's how it's configured and enforced. So if you have an E3 license, you can get to a very secure state with that. There are additional licenses which do have some additional security features, but they're not 100% necessary for this. Okay, so I just want to cover next steps. In terms of next steps at CPS, we do deliver an Intune endpoint security assessment, which involves us working with you on discovering what existing endpoint security controls you currently have in place and what may be missing, delivering a full technical Intune health assessment to highlight opportunities for improvement in all of the areas we discussed today, and there are a lot more that I couldn't cover just because of time. And we provide prioritized findings using impact versus effort scoring to craft a immediately actionable roadmap with recommendations. So to give you a clear view of what your quick wins are, high risk issues, and strategic incentives. So if you're interested, please don't hesitate to reach out directly at hello@cps.co.uk, or you can dial the number on screen for an initial conversation. Secondly, I've written a blog post on this topic, so if you do want to read more, you can scan the QR code on your screen. It will take you directly to the post. If you have any issues with that, you can visit the blog section on our website, and I think it's one of the latest ones on there, so it's fairly recent. Okay. So thank you very much for your time today. If you found the session helped you and you'd like to learn more, please don't hesitate to get in touch using the details on screen. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Also, the blog link is in the chat. So if you do want that link and you can scan the QR code, you can click on that there and it will take you directly there. So thank you very much for attending, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.